Hey folks, I've got an update for you today. So, as many of you know, in late 2023, Stoplight was involved in a merger with SmartBear, and essentially our path forward is going to be looking at how SwaggerHub and Stoplight, kind of the best two parts of those platforms, come together, and we're hot and heavy in the process of starting to figure that out. With that in mind, with so many other things to go do, we've thought it best to put the API Intersection podcast on hold indefinitely. It's been an incredible 3 years learning from all of you on, what works at any scale, right? How do we build API programs successfully? Kind of what's the cutting edge? What's the best practice? And we really appreciate all of your support. And, we'll still look forward to connecting with folks in the community. And we'll see what the future brings and maybe bringing the show back. So thanks as always.
It accounts for a majority of it in the sense of administering care and all the kind of workflows that you have to support from a CMS perspective, or the integrations you have with providers and payers. It does not support, however, kind of the rest of the business. So how do you actually manage a lot of your retail workflows and internal processes and whatnot? So it does make it easier for us to share externally, and as we integrate with others in the kind of broader healthcare ecosystem, having those standards in place is definitely helpful. The side of that, however, is it takes a lot for some of these teams to actually get to that point.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. As always, I'm your host, Jason Harmon, CTO at Stoplight. So today I'm pretty stoked to finally make a connection that's been kind of pending for about 6 months. Some folks that I met at a conference, Bryan Thomas and Puneet Kumar from Humana, just by chance after giving a talk, came by, said hi, and turns out they're doing some really interesting stuff with an API program there. So Bryan and Puneet, thanks for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So I guess it's sometimes we have brands on here where it's like, tell us what you do and explain it. I think we all kind of know roughly what Humana does, but I guess it'd be interesting to hear from you two kind of what y'all are doing there. And Humana is a huge place, so perhaps how you kind of fit into that picture regarding APIs. So this is always fun with two people. We're just going to go whoever feels punchy and wants to talk. So I'm just going to throw it out there. Y'all do your thing.
Absolutely. And we work so closely in the office that we play off of each other the whole time anyway. So so again, I'm Bryan Thomas, Director of Product for our Enterprise API and Integration teams here at Humana. Specifically, we sit within the enterprise function in general, kind of a strong partner with enterprise architecture. So from that perspective, Humana obviously has a lot of different legal entities under its umbrella. You have Humana, but you also have CenterWell. From our perspective, we're within the Humana side, or the insurance side. Humana has a large footprint in Medicare Advantage specifically, but also has many other products and services that they offer on top of that. But kind of the majority is Medicare Advantage, pharmacy, and Medicare. So or Medicaid. So with that, we sit again within the enterprise function. We kind of oversee a lot of the integration technologies, practices, patterns. We kind of advise and understand what's kind of going on with any new API development, service development across Humana. So Humana, or Puneet, can speak a little bit more from his perspective as well.
Thank you, Bryan. Hello, everyone. This is Puneet Kumar. I'm a director working for Humana in Enterprise API and Integration team. My team is particularly responsible for architecture, standards, and governance. We help application teams in building resilient, scalable, standards-based APIs. So to put it into different words, we accelerate their standards-based API journey. we are think of us as an advocate for building consumption oriented enterprise reusable APIs which could be reused across the organization. So we advise application teams in kind of in throughout the API journey on how to kind of design APIs, how to build APIs, and how to do the operations as well.
So in terms of kind of the scope of what we're talking about today, I guess APIs means a lot of things these days. So it sounds like the internal component is a big one. I would sort of presume that there's probably a lot of partners at play in integrating with these things. And I guess finally, are there any sort of like public facing things that are generally consumed?
Yeah, so that kind of goes into my area specifically around our enterprise kind of API catalog, as well as our developer experiences, developer portal. But from that perspective, you have internally a lot of our effort, time and energy goes internal, focused around whether they be our channels that are just internal channels like websites, mobile apps, others, or if it's direct integration with some of our providers and other payers as part of CMS advises or directs a lot of the interoperability standards around patient access API, provider directory API, and some of the consumer facing. Ultimately, the consumer is in charge of their data, and if they're consenting to go and share that data with another payer provider, we have to be able to allow that and be able to support that. So from that perspective, we have kind of two different developer portals, one external facing that really supports a lot of B2B, B2C, and then we also have an internal portal that supports all of our internal, whether they be the enterprise APIs that we help design and direct, or channel APIs, domain APIs. So it's all kind of visible in one ecosystem is what we're shooting towards. So with that, yeah. So as you could imagine, with as large as Humana is, pretty much any type of consumer you could think of is somewhere in our ecosystem, and we have to be able to support them in kind of a standardized way. So
speaking of standards, I haven't done much with it myself, but I've seen a lot over the last few years with the FHIR standard, FHIR. Is that when you guys talk about standardizing, I have to assume some of that's kind of proprietary, but are there sort of industry API standards for healthcare that y'all are involved in as well?
Yeah, so they've been around for quite some time. FHIR is kind of the latest version, and it accounts for a majority of it in the sense of administering care and all the kind of workflows that you have to support from a CMS perspective, or the integrations you have with providers and payers. It does not support, however, kind of the rest of the business. So how do you actually manage a lot of your retail workflows and internal processes and whatnot? So it does make it easier for us to share externally, and as we integrate with others in the kind of broader healthcare ecosystem, having those standards in place is definitely helpful. The side of that, however, is it takes a lot for some of these teams to actually get to that point, and being able to understand how do you actually even create some of these APIs to be able to surface this information, let alone have it in a format that's actually highly kind of predictable or reusable, like the FHIR structure.
So I have to assume, and you had kind of mentioned before, it's a very large organization with a whole lot going on in terms of APIs. And the first thing that comes to mind for me, of course, is how do you manage a catalog like that? There's a lot going on, and I have to imagine a lot of different divisions involved, not to mention partners and all that. How do you guys kind of approach building and maintaining a catalog of that size? And call me a junkie here, but I love hearing the number and scale of things. So, but I don't want to get y'all in trouble either. So, feel free to obfuscate if you like.
No, I think the biggest thing with this is number one, understanding kind of the landscape, what actually exists out there, what are the different integrations in place, whether they be RESTful APIs, or a lot in the industry still does SFTP, and we don't actually even use APIs to exchange this data. So they're doing bulk files and whatnot. So with that, the very first step is just to understand what all exists, and what you may or may not want to catalog within an enterprise API catalog. Also, some of that is what is currently behind, some form of a API management tool or a gateway rather than just exposed directly. So that was a large portion of the beginning of our work, is to just discover what's out there and have a better understanding of the landscape. Now that quickly evolved into what are the different categories, or the different, I think categories is probably the right term for this, to make it as simple as possible. But what are the different categories in which you would organize those APIs to make sense to anyone that's looking at this catalog? So from that perspective, we have in the past probably over 3,000 I'll call them classic APIs or legacy APIs that we needed to go through and kind of determine what the current state of those are, what's the value that they bring the organization, and kind of help make sense of that so we can actually make a catalog and appropriately catalog them. So with that, we do have multiple categories within the enterprise API catalog, and it's also, those APIs are different level of maturity as well. So that goes to the kind of taxonomy, classification, and how we organize those within there. But the thing that we've learned through all of this, because there's so much change in the landscape as well, a lot of people don't understand from an API perspective the opportunity you have to reuse those assets or build them for scale. And so that's why Humana has 3,000 plus services or APIs, is because you typically have an API or service built for a single consumer, or very, very specific to the needs of that individual, rather than built for something that multiple users can use and or filter based on what they need. So that was the very first understanding, is what all was there. Then we needed to go and figure out what would be valuable within a catalog. And that's what we've been working on for the last year and a half, is to really distill that into something that is easily digestible for an end consumer looking to figure out what is available to them and what they can gain access to.
So it's certainly, there are different ways to go about that kind of categorizing. Some people call these like capability sets or whatever. There's different labels. There's certainly an architectural view to these things, right? Is like, if you're looking internally at the landscape of APIs, how do these sort of Lego blocks plug together? But then it's always arguable that, well, these things should be in customer language and understandable. Like, what are the kind of considerations you guys are putting into this from sort of the product and engineering side to figure out how to organize that? And I love, by the way, that you called out that it's almost always a green field. No one starts from scratch these days, right? There's always legacy you're carrying around that has to fit in those boxes too.
So I'll start to answer that, and then I'm going to pass it over to Puneet to kind of really provide a lot more context. But the one thing that we quickly realized is through all the APIs that are APIs and or services that exist at Humana, is they really lack the interaction from a consumer perspective. What are they solving, or what are they actually supporting? And due to that, you have things that are providing way more information or data than you would actually want, or you're having to stitch together several different endpoints to actually realize the value, and it makes it overcomplicated. So from our perspective, and what we've been really driving, is that consumer oriented view, or to really, as you go from like a design first approach, how do you make it designed to solving that interaction or the need for the consumer, rather than how we manage that internally or how that data is exposed from our systems? And that fundamentally challenges how Humana or healthcare in general has looked at providing data or integration or any interoperability. Is you're going from kind of that outside in view, consumer view in, and it poses a real challenge in regard to how these teams can support. And there's a lot of education and training and whatnot that has to come from that. But the value in that is having that agreement and that design, and you can drive alignment to that before teams even go and start building these components, is critical. So you're not wasting time, or you're not wasting energy on going and building something where no one's going to use it, or you're not getting adoption. Now, how that trickles down into some of Puneet's space with the architecture, kind of standards and governance, I'll let him speak to that.
So Puneet, since Bryan described to us that sometimes the APIs are too small, sometimes they're too big, you're going to give us the Goldilocks principle and tell us how big a microservice should be, right?
when you know that there's no right answer to that. But in a large enterprise, right? Like I fully agree that the API should be, consumption oriented, right? Like now there are people use different terms. Some people call it outside in approach or consumption oriented or consumer oriented APIs. I think they're one and the same thing, right? Now you will hear a lot of people in the industry, saying, API exposes this data or that data, right? When somebody uses this term, I feel that that they are building inside out, not really outside in, right? In that case, what happens is if you're building inside out, your APIs become too chatty. They're very tightly coupled with your kind of domain complexities, right? So that's something you want to avoid to your consumers, right? So that's why I think outside in strategy generally would apply to any product, in my opinion, right? Like how does that work? What is outside in strategy? You basically observe your market, you understand your consumers, and then you design your product based on your consumer needs. So if you think of your API as a product, then that's how you should design it, right? There should be focused on the consumption. Now there your APIs could be consumed by other systems. They could be consumed by web applications, mobile applications, external partners, right? So you have to design your API in such a way so that it could be reused by all of these different consumers of the API. Now, I think you brought up a good point. The granularity of the API is a key thing to kind of account for when you're designing an API. It shouldn't be to my opinion, it depends on use case to use case, right? It depends on, what kind of organization you are working for. It kind of also depends on, the frequency of changes to the API. So I would say, you have to kind of meet in the middle. They shouldn't be, too small or too big, right? Like, and the frequency of changes is a very key factor in my opinion. And there are a lot of kind of complexities to this, right? Like, so when you're using an API management tool, right, you need to kind of proxy your API in the API management, right? So granularity comes into the picture, there as well, because do you want to make the changes every time, like, so for example, if you have like multiple microservices within a multiple endpoints within a single API specification, does it make sense to kind of club them all together within a single specification? Because every time you kind of change a single endpoint, you might want to, you have to kind of update your version, and then you have to update your proxy as well. So do you want to do that, or to what level you want to do that? So these are some of the factors, these are some of the things to kind of keep in mind, to decide the right granularity of the API.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, from talking to folks like yourselves for 3 years now, I think, this is the way forward, right? Be customer centric, make things reusable, right? Like these are in some ways kind of almost naively simple concepts. Putting it into practice is a different story, of course. Actually, this year I've the sort of talk that I've been iterating on at a few different conferences is API as a product, and really the message is pretty simple: is it's just another product. Like manage it like a product. That's all you have to do. And to your point, like, design it for the consumers that are going to use it in the end. Use that language, right? Like some of these things are kind of simple, but I guess my experience has been that simple as it sounds, getting a bunch of people across a big enterprise to agree on what these things should look like is another story. So how do you guys approach sort of, workshopping that or organizing these things and driving that alignment?
Yes, I think one key thing to note, which is what you're kind of going towards, but one thing to note is, we could have the best technologies, we could have the smartest people on the team supporting these efforts. At the end of the day, it truly is a culture thing. So it's understanding of how you're actually driven or driving towards solving a challenge or the problem that you have from a consumer perspective, and being able to rally the team and get kind of an energy behind solving that is very, very challenging sometimes, because you have a lot of different people that have to come into kind of the conversation, whether they be those that manage the domain of the data themselves and the systems and the infrastructure, or you have those that are actually subscribing to it or consuming to it from a channel perspective, whether they be web apps or external or whatever it may be. But there's a lot of differing opinions and different levels of maturity and understanding of the technology. And so, at the end of the day, I think tools do make it easier, and processes and patterns do make it easier. But it really is, how do you build that trust and that respect across the different areas to actually be very transparent in the problems or challenges that you're seeing, and working towards an end goal or a end result, and getting that value. Over the past year and a half or 2 years, specifically with Humana, but prior to that as well, I think the most important thing you can do is focus on building those relationships and building the respect around those that are going to be so critical to that program or that effort. If you don't invest enough time there, you could do the most amazing work and you won't get value out of it, because it was either not designed correctly, or it wasn't adopted at the scale or level that you would expect. And that truly comes down to the buy-in and the support that you get from those that you need to be able to get that moving forward. So.
Yeah, and I think it's like, on one side, my experience has been real simple: is if you get a group of folks talking about the customer, you can achieve a lot of things. If, to your earlier point, you do the Conway maneuver wrong here and get people talking about the systems they own, you're in trouble and you'll never get out of it. Which it's kind of like you got to give the domain owner their ownership. But that, I think, brings us to the question of, like, all right, if we're unifying things and all these things are going to fit together and kind of look, feel, smell like one platform, that implies that they're designed in some similar manner and there's some standard applied to that. And as hard as it is to get people to agree on what to call things and categorize them, agreeing on what the technical standard should be is perhaps even more challenging. So I'd love to hear how you guys approach that.
I mean, I would kind of like to kind of touch base on standards a little bit, to answer your question. I think to explain standards a little bit from my perspective, I think we have to kind of understand APIs a little bit, right? I think everybody understands that API is a contract between two systems, right? Using which they talk to each other. It's an abstraction between the API producer and the consumer, right? Now, in an organization, there could be various systems, right? Like, I'll give you an example let's take an example of a hospitality company, right? So you would have a reservation system, you would have a member system, a property management system, right? Now, if every system is going to offer APIs, they have to look consistent in order for the API consumers to understand those APIs, right? Now, this is where you could say open API comes into picture. It provides you a way to structure your APIs. It provides a framework to standardize your APIs. Now, I believe the need for standardization in a large organization kind of goes beyond that, right? You have to kind of establish what sort of naming conventions the teams have to use. What is my versioning strategy, what is my exception handling structure going to look like, what is my logging format, what is my caching strategy. There are I believe there should be some guidelines on the status codes usage as well, because there's a lot of confusion between the people, right? Like, especially amongst developers, right? Like, I'll give you an example. A lot of people get confused between where do I use 400 status code versus 422, right? So you would see a lot of kind of implementations which are not correct, right, based on the standard. So I believe that there should be properly documented standards for each organization, right? Now, I can provide the standards, as, let's say, if I am kind of leading the API program, right? So I can provide the standards to the organization, but I can't expect the organization to change overnight, right? I mean, it's unfair for a very large organization to kind of adopt to new standards, overnight or within a few weeks or even within a couple of months, right? So I think what we have to do is to do continuous education, right? Like raise more awareness through through office hours, through multiple sessions, road shows across the organization, and find some early adopters, right? Find early adopters, work with them, build some standards-based APIs, prove the value, and then that would help increase the adoption of standards-based APIs.
And I mean, just to add to that, I think that's why we continue to see like developer relations come up time and time again. Like, how do you actually support them, and you're listening and getting that feedback, and also helping to use that as an opportunity to educate and to help get a little bit closer aligned and to the direction that you're wanting to head or needing to head from a standards perspective. But the other side of that is, and I always level this up internally when I have conversations with others that may be technical or not technical, but how do you suppose a group of 10 people, if they all speak a different language, come together and have a conversation? Like, it's near impossible, or you're going to have a really complex translator there that can understand 10 different languages to try to distill that into something that makes sense and to have that conversation. But it takes a tremendous amount of time if you were to have a translator do that every time, rather than us all using, all speaking the same language in some form or fashion, and have more, standardized interactions. So, yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge with Humana is every one of those APIs or services are built a little bit different, and so you can't. Anytime you're trying to subscribe or consume to one of those, it's a whole new effort to understand what it means, what they mean by each field, or what data is exposing and the format of that data. And it takes a considerable amount of time for our developers, rather than just to be able to easily discover and already have some foundation of what to expect and consume or subscribe to that API.
So Puneet, you make error handling sound hard. The server does 500s by default if you don't do anything. So that's the cheat code, listeners. Just, it's 500s for everything. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, so if you're working in an organization, where resiliency is very, very important, right? I mean, we take it for granted. Some of these APIs are revenue impacting APIs, right? So we need to be able to kind of handle the exceptions correctly, return the right status codes, because your consumers of the APIs are behaving based on that, right?
Oh,
So
I mean, I'll go simpler than that. What's the first thing that most developers encounter when they try an API? An error.
Yeah.
So put your best foot forward, do good error handling and good messaging, and they'll have a good experience and get integrated faster. So,
Yeah.
Sometimes when we talk about this stuff with program leaders, I feel like, it's a little like fluffy, overly positive kumbaya that like, well, we'll just have the right discussion and it'll all work out. But, I always kind of have to push like, is any of this enforced, or is this all just an influential suggestion? And I guess, is there sort of process to review these things to ensure that it, complies with whatever the requirements are?
Every organization, in my opinion, should invest in an API governance program, right? Governance in it's a way of ensuring that your standards are being followed right now. And also governance should apply throughout the life cycle of the API. Now, organization take different approaches to governance, right? And it also depends on to what extent you want to apply governance. Do you want to do it through manual reviews or only limited to API design? Some organizations like to kind of go all in, invest into kind of building automations. My personal opinion, right, and it also depends on kind of funding and leadership alignment you have to kind of implement a governance program. But with the evolution of so many tooling around API governance, right, I think an organization should definitely invest into automating some of these capabilities, so that you're actually accelerating the API journey, not really becoming a bottleneck, right? I mean, I have personally worked in various different organizations. I've been kind of in the API space for almost a decade now. So you could have, a review board or a governance board, which would take weeks or days to kind of review stuff, right? Then you would lose the credibility with application teams, right? Like, because they're going to reach out to their leader and say, we have these new standards and governance, which is taking a lot more time than it used to, right? So you're going to get pushback on your strategy. So invest into automation so that you can provide real time or near real time feedback to the application teams. Like, I'll give you an example. If somebody is designing an API, right, you might want to think about, implementing that linting capability, use Spectral or whatever tool you like, right? Invest into that automation so that you get the real time feedback on your design, so that somebody's not waiting for an email response or a Jira ticket for days to kind of get feedback on the specification, right? Like, so you're providing that real-time feedback, and then somebody's fixing it, and so there's no manual intervention, right?
And I think, I mean, that's also the term of like invisible governance. You're working towards, ultimately making it easier to where they want to adopt or use that, your tooling and technologies or developer portal, is because they have that understanding that that's baked in and they're going to be supported, and it's actually faster, easier for them to get some of those things done, rather than the way that they were doing it with manual, review boards or committees or whatever it may be. I think that it's a very important and critical thing, specifically in something heavily regulated like, healthcare or financial industry, or anything that you're dealing with a lot of PHI, PII, PFI in those interactions. So obviously, there's still a lot of manual overhead for valid reason on specific things, and the sensitivity of information that's being shared, and making sure contracts and agreements are in place that they actually can have access to that. But a lot of those things, they still follow a very consistent pattern. And as long as we're defining what those patterns are, and if you're following that pattern and you're this type of user, it makes it easier for them at the end of the day. I won't also, I think it's critical to also note in the beginning, when those don't exist, it's a big challenge, specifically when you're trying to drive this notion or this strategy to make it easier, and you're actually not. When you're in the beginning, you're actually making it harder while you're learning what needs to be done, and there's a lot of manual intervention, specifically from a standards and governance perspective, also from API as a product and design perspective, because you're learning like the intricacies of these things, and how do you make that real, and how do you actually automate some of those pieces. Like it's more high touch, it slows things down in the beginning, but the intent, and this is where that trust and that relationship goes, is they have to understand the vision and where you're headed and what's that long-term strategy, so they're more bought in, and they're not just pushing back and saying like, this is overkill, this is causing too much work for us, and we're just going to go back to what we were doing. That it's definitely a juggling act, and you have to make sure you're actually showing some of that progress and getting making it easier for them, while you're still delivering value and supporting those teams in what they need to be doing. So it's a huge challenge, especially in a complex organization. So
Yeah, it's certainly a story we hear a lot from kind of, stoplight community, is like, you kind of get the mandate, very little funding, very little money, very few people, because frankly, there's very few people who have the expertise to lead these things, right? It's an incredible talent shortage. And, Puneet, I too have gone through all those kind of manual review things, and slogged through having a months long backlog, watching people disengage from the process and come after you with torches and pitchforks. Like, I'd never want to do it again. Bryan, to your point, where do you start? Everyone starts manual, right? And so my goal is always that you can get things to be 80% plus of the basic automatable rules are taken care of, so that your review can be really a discussion about kind of relevance and meaning. Why does this thing exist? Who is it for? Let's let that inform those naming discussions and that sort of stuff. But let's not talk about whether it should be underscores or dashes or, that stuff. Let's talk about that once, write a rule and put it out of our minds and trust that it's taken care of. And I love too that you made the point that when you start the API program, I, I think a lot of business leaders get caught up in the idea that, well, APIs are going to open us up to be more innovative and move faster. And that might be true, but setting the expectation that that's probably true in 3 to 5 years in a lot of cases in a larger organization. And the reality is you got to slow down to speed up, right? And I think folks get caught up and don't explain that and find themselves 18 to 24 months in getting, kind of clipped on budget because it's like, well, you didn't prove the value yet. You actually slowed things down. People hate you. So it's a tough message to build, and it's a tough kind of, you've got to have long-term vision support, which you called out, Bryan. That's great.
Yeah, and I think, another big piece of that is, especially from a business perspective, at the end of the day, you're making it easier to deliver business value and to solve the needs for the consumers, but not at the cost of incurring a substantial amount of operational costs along the way. And that's, when you're not making things easily discoverable, highly reusable or scalable, following a consistency or supporting, standards, you again are creating these very specific point-to-point interactions, tightly coupled interactions that take a substantial amount of subject matter expertise to even know what's done there and what they're doing. But any new consumer or use case that comes forward, you build another one, and you keep stacking those on top of each other. You incur a substantial amount of organizational costs or operational costs, and that also is what business cares about, which is like, okay, great, we're investing all this time and money and energy to build these APIs, but we're seeing that it's really expensive and it's not actually, solving or getting the return on investment. That the key piece of that is that they need to be designed highly kind of reusable, scalable, and meet the needs of that consumer or that use case without being like so tightly coupled or overly specific for that individual. And that again is a challenge, but also at the end of the day, you're actually saving a substantial amount of cost. Those teams don't have to go and build a new API every time that they're trying to deliver a use case, and reuse something that's already there. So they're much quicker, they're much faster when they need to change something for a website or interact or exchange some information with a provider or payer if something's already there and they don't have to go rebuild it. So a lot of our time is just providing visibility or insight around the operational costs that these teams are incurring as well, or kind of total cost of ownership over a period of time. So.
Yeah, we have to remind ourselves sometimes that what we're talking about is an emerging discipline of design, right? How to design a platform. And it's really not even APIs, it's how to design a whole platform. And like any designer, it's a thankless job sometimes because the question of, is it good? It's kind of subjective. So you're always improving, you're always iterating. And it's pretty rare that it's quite recognized for the total value it's bringing, and hard to attribute how much better it is, right? So it's design, and design is messy and hard, and it's about people. So that's okay. It's just getting, as you guys said earlier, multiple times, like, don't boil the ocean, start small, iterate, learn at each step. I think that's the part where folks get it wrong, and don't spend a year or two talking about standards. Go build something, have crappy standards, and make them better after your first launch, right?
Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like y'all are on the right track. Certainly lots of familiar stories here from the kinds of things we hear from successful programs. I guess any sort of closing thoughts or things that you wanted to share that we missed?
The only thing I would say is that like, if you are, this is probably a message to all leaders out there, right? Like, so if you really want to achieve digital transformation in your organization, then my opinion, the APIs should be at the center of it, right? So you need to kind of, invest into that API program, make sure it has the right leadership support, make sure it has the right funding, and invest into, and start small, right? As Jason and Bryan, you said, like, start small, start with some sort of standards, find some early adopters, learn through it, iterate over it, right? Roll out multiple versions of standards, right? Like, eventually your standards and governance program would would become mature as you go through your journey, right? And invest into automations, right? Like don't have a lot of kind of manual governance checkpoints, right? Invest into automations. There would still be manual reviews which need to happen, but I think we can minimize that by building a lot of automations throughout the life cycle. And think about governance throughout the life cycle. A lot of people assume that governance when it comes to APIs is just the design governance. To me, I think we have to think about the overall life cycle, starting from design to development to the operation side of it, right? Like how do you apply right security? How do you ensure that your API is scalable? How do you ensure that your API is being monitored properly, right? You want to ensure that your API is logging all the right information as well, right? So think about the entire life cycle, and how you can apply the standards and governance throughout the life cycle is the key to a successful governance program, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that ties back to also taking API aside, just any general product management, product development. What are the core things that you care about? And it goes back to lifecycle management. You're looking at the total picture, and you're actual managing that API as a product, and it goes through different stages of product stages, whether it's a new product to market, it's an existing product, or you're looking to sunset or depreciate it. But at the end of the day, that full having a view and managing the full life cycle is absolutely critical. Otherwise, there's a missed opportunity there for sure.
Well said. Feels like a good spot to wrap. Thanks again, gentlemen, for joining and sharing your, kind of the story of your journey here. And certainly wish you the best of luck going forward.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you so much.